Thank you for your applause. So yeah, there we go. Like holy crap. It's like, so yeah, see, I was kind of laughing, like, let's set expectations. It's a good presentation, not a great one. But I only have to be better than all the tech speakers. So how hard could that be? And no offense to our fine tech partners, I've very much enjoyed giving you much of my money over the years. It's a lot of us are, becoming accustomed again to face-to-face meetings, and it's interesting what you forget. So I used to travel about half the time, and you go to conventions and board meetings and stuff like this. And when you're traveling that much, like everything's kind of a checklist. Do I have this? Do I have that? And you're walking down this checklist to make sure you don't forget anything, before you get to the L. And so I'm coming out here, and I'm kind of like, I know I've forgotten something, and I'm just walking through. Because I live, downtown, and I'm in my head, I'm going through this checklist of something. What have I not brought with me that I know I'm going to need, after the last year and a half? And finally, it made perfect sense. And the comment from the Uber driver made perfect sense. Pants. I need pants. And then I was hoping at some point I could wear my super fancy slippers that I've had for like a year now. But like Sherry's like, wear shoes. I'm like, okay, fair enough. The other thing I've enjoyed, actually, that I didn't realize I would enjoy it as a result of there's some bug going around, the pandemic, is all these places, have you noticed? Free cologne. Yeah. I know how much the ladies like a sterile man. So it's okay to laugh. I'm not very appropriate.
That wasn't funny.
So I was once described at ASE in one of the evaluations as he was inappropriate and offensive, but my speaker bio says I'm provocative. And that's how you say that without insulting everybody. But let's not get serious, but let's kind of walk through the presentation, because one of the things we've done at Association Laboratory is look backward a little bit. And this phrase has kind of stuck with me over the last year. So a black swan is something like an occurrence, something you haven't planned on. It's basically an experience beyond your expectations. And so when you sat there in January of 2019 and started putting together your business assumptions, probably very few of you said, well, what if we have a global pandemic? As a side note, we actually tested that in 2016, and 25% of you did have a global pandemic. It was slightly above zombie apocalypse. And so for me, like that period between January of 2019 and April of 2020 was just 100 years long, because everything behind you was suddenly irrelevant. And what I like to kind of portray it as is you had all these assumptions behind your strategy, your personal life, your professional life, your organization and association's life in January 2020. By June, they were just lying in rubble. The business assumptions behind membership, the business assumptions behind strategic planning, the business assumptions behind the digital and operational infrastructure you'll need to be successful, in rubble. And so we all had to figure out what to do. And so at Association Laboratory, I call this the end of history. Associations in particular look backward. We had 87% retention last year, so we'll probably have 87 this year. We had 1,000 attendees last year, we'll probably have 1,000 this year. And we measured our success based on a backwards looking frame of reference. Well, when the rear view mirror gets torn off your car, where do you look? And you start looking forward. And so what we started to do at Association Laboratory is put together a series of sector studies under the Looking Forward banner. And what our goal is to understand the issues impacting association members and how those issues impacted their relationship with the association and the challenges it created. We wanted to assess then the strategies that associations were pursuing to adapt. And now, and as of today, we also studied DEI specifically and released that data today. And I know the first two studies you've got as part of your handouts. So what I want to do today is walk through some of the themes of this data collected from people just like you, except with really good jobs, who are at home in their offices doing work, and kind of identify the emerging trends we see coming out of the pandemic and how that's going to impact the strategy environment that you're going to have to be successful in, and then impact all the decisions you're going to have to make as it relates to it. So at the end of the day, we're not trying to be successful today. we're trying to be successful at some future state. And so at some level, we have to say, well, what are the assumptions behind the future? What are going to influence those decisions? And so what we found out at Association Laboratory, when we looked across hundreds of association leaders who participated in our sector studies, basically 6 things. One, what I call the COVID-19 hangover. The second is a reimagining of space. The next one is economic disruption, key on the disruption component. The next one is about workforce realignment and the intersection of professions and industries. The next is technological interconnectedness. And you can tell my first lesson of the day is try not to use the phrase technological interconnectedness in your presentations. Because I'm particularly, I speak good and it's hard to say. And finally, and I just had an interesting conversation with one of your peers, well, not a peer of yours, he's crazy smart, but one of my peers, and about competition between professions and sectors that I think is going to be interesting. See, you were afraid to laugh earlier. Now everyone's now overly encouraged by it. Okay, good to see it. So let's talk about this stuff. So I love cocktails. My actual corporate blog is called From My Seat at the Bar. And the very first blog was how the Manhattan is the perfect metaphor for business strategy. Easy to make, readily accessible ingredients, easy to teach, easy to scale. At the end of the day, you're drinking whiskey. So that's the first blog. It goes downhill from there. But the adaptation of industries and professions isn't going to end. So part of me wants to stop framing this as a new normal, or we're going to go back to something or forward to something. The world's just a different place. And here's where it starts to show up in the data. Nearly 6 out of 10 of the respondents identify the long-term cost of adapting to COVID-19 as being a significant issue impacting their members. What's important about this graph isn't so much the specifics of the adoption of virtual office, the space or process reconfiguration. What's important is the time frame, 3 years. This is not something that's going to be over. Okay, so the industries and professions you can see are virtually rethinking every aspect of how they work as a result of the pandemic. In fact, a great example I got from one of our clients in industrial hygiene was that the pandemic will influence our professions and industries the way 9/11 influenced everything from buildings to airport security. It wasn't a massive thing. It was suddenly your government building had a bunch of solid concrete planters out front. You know, suddenly building codes were adapted to take into account fire in a different way. And things of that nature. It was 100 incremental steps designed to adapt everything we do to the influence of our concerns about physical security as a result of that. You'll see the same thing out of COVID. That creates tremendous opportunities for people. The second is what I call the reimagining of space. So when you think about your life 2 years ago, think about a normal day. You know, you get up and you know, maybe you walk downtown and you get a cup of coffee, you get in your car and you drop your kids off to school. You know, you go to work, you walk down the street to have lunch with colleagues, maybe go to a health club afterward or some equivalent thing like that, pick your kids up. But your day was movement from space to space to space to space. How many in the room commuted to downtown from somewhere in the northwest suburbs? Actually, fewer than I would expected, or fewer had admitted. But that was just a normal part of life, okay? Well, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of these activities have become centralized in the home. You've spent a long time perhaps educating your kids at home, your entertainment's at home. Worst for me and my spouse was we were at home, because she used to travel all the time and I used to travel all the time. We never had to spend time together, which was great for our marriage. So like my wife is super interesting. I never knew that. Super, super cool. Well, here's how it starts to show up. Over half said fears about the desire to congregate. Fears that reduce or change travel patterns. Do you take a car instead of public transit? Do you drive instead of fly? Those sorts of things, okay. And again, this is 3 years. And the issue here, again, we're clearly gathered face to face. And I have been going to board meetings and conventions now since June. Some of you have traveled throughout the last year. So it's not that all of that's going to go away. But for a lot of us, our behaviors have changed. Okay, and once you've spent a year and a half doing something different, you might go back to what you've done before, but now you're thinking about why would I? And it's the behavioral change that will be the long-term implication. It's not that you'll never go to a bar again or never drop your kids off at school again. It's that maybe it'll be somewhat different in some way. I was just talking about the impact in downtown Chicago, where our office is at. On a weekday, it's pretty empty. But my neighborhood in Ukrainian Village is really vibrant because all the people leave their house and go eat lunch. So that's the kind of second big thing. Third is economic disruption. And I think the key here is disruption, because a lot of professions, a lot of industries prospered during the pandemic. This was not a financial crisis where the economy collapsed. Again, I go back to one of our clients in industrial hygiene. These are the companies that wash your hotel seats, but also your hospital uniforms and sheets. So half of their membership was going out of business. The other half of their membership was working 24 hours a day for the hospitals. And so a lot of this adaptation has been phenomenal. But what uncertainty does is create hesitancy. So I think my company has done this, we've even done it personally. You didn't realize how much money you thought you might have to have on hand. How long do you have to go without your convention? How long do you have to go without your clients? How long do you have to invest in your home office and homeschooling, all those sorts of things? So suddenly you're a little more nervous of getting rid of those resources because you're less certain about what the future is going to look like. So if I'm one of your members, that hesitancy means that your value proposition to me has to be crystal clear. They're not going to do it just for fun. You should be able to tell me exactly why I'm going to give you my limited resources. And that's requiring associations to focus on the true value proposition in ways they were not forced to prior to the pandemic. And that's not to say you shouldn't have, by the way. Again, we've worked on member value proposition for 22 years. It's a never-ending process as your audiences change to do something different for them. The pandemic forced us to do something differently. There's some data on that going forward. But this disruption also created a lot of creativity. The easiest solution or the example for us in our sector is the virtual conferences. And all the Zooms we've been in, all the things that maybe we did it occasionally 5 years ago or 3 years ago, but now we do it so routinely that we don't think about it. Think of a restaurant that now delivers or has carryout that didn't before. Well, if you've just come up with this innovation that was successful, are you going to get rid of it simply because the pandemic is over? If you've just done a successful conference, virtual conference, and a couple of thousand people participated and everyone said it was great, are you just going to tell all your members next year, well, that was a one-off. Let's just go back to the way things were? Probably not. But no other industry is going to do that either. The next one is what I call the workforce realignment. The faces, competencies, and needs of the workforce are changing because the people they serve and the companies they work for are changing, okay? Because a disrupted economy creates movement. Maybe it's movement because you got furloughed or got fired. Maybe it's movement because my current employer sucks and I want to work somewhere else and there's plenty of opportunities right now. Maybe it's because your spouse has a better job, whatever it might be. But that movement is forcing people to consider, why am I here and why am I doing what I'm doing when I have other choices? And I think that's a great opportunity for associations who aggregate people by profession and industry to give them a platform to do those searches. Over 6 out of 10 of the people who responded to our study identified recruiting and retaining a qualified resource as the #1 issue facing their members. If I'd have showed you this graph from 2 years ago, it still would have been the top thing. And 2 years before that, and 2 years before that. This has been #1 for 10 straight years, 11 years of the study. The 1 year it wasn't was the pandemic. And this was #2. So the workforce issues are problems that existed before that are now being exaggerated and exacerbated. Don't use the word exacerbated very often either. That's kind of fun. By the pandemic. And so, again, a great opportunity for associations to take advantage of this. Technological interconnectedness. What has happened to us as people over the last 10 years is we suddenly have the capacity and capability to talk to everyone in the world whenever we want. Our phone can talk to other phones. Our car can talk to our phones. Our doorbell can tell us somebody's at the door. It's all a result of what's called the Internet of Everything. And that's a clever combination of the internet and everything. But again, when your car tells you that it needs servicing, when it tells your dealer it needs servicing, that's an example of that. When your doorbell tells you your 12,000th Amazon package has arrived, that's an example of that. When your wife texts you from the couch asking you to get her a glass of wine from right beside you, that is not the Internet of Everything. But what it does is destroy historical boundaries. Think of how many associations are the Illinois Society of a thing or the American Society of thing. Information, communication, and money don't care about your geography. They don't care. The barriers to me as a tiny consulting firm talking to someone in India are effectively zero. So what associations used to do was take a profession or an industry and aggregate them. And then you build a wall around it and you charge people to come through the wall. Well, why should I go through the wall when I can go around it? And the elimination of barriers between markets, between competitors, between partners, between people, all of those strategies become less viable as a result, which A means if you are the Illinois Society of something incredible, you can produce a thing and sell it to somebody in India and sell it to somebody somewhere else. The bad news is someone can do the same thing to you. And so I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is to what extent geographic boundaries are going to define us and limit us versus simply guide us, particularly at the state level and the national level. So this is the meatier, that was the easy part of the presentation. Here's a little bit of the harder part. And it's the nature of competition and how that's changing. Okay, so when we analyzed competition out of the study, we used Porter's 5 forces. And the old story is not true that he had 5 forces because there's 5 fingers on a hand. That's complete falsehood. That's an urban myth. But it's an interesting way of looking at competition from an association standpoint, and that's why we use it, because it looks at the ecosystem of the competition, and you can see it. Who's an existing competitor? Who's a threat of a new entrant, a similar organization or profession coming into it? There's supplier power. If you want to know what supplier power is, when you're a tiny association going to Marriott and trying to get discounted room rates, that's supplier power. Why, yes, we will discount that $10 more per night, as an example. And so that's an example of their influence, but you're also a buyer. So when you're doing a citywide and you come in and you want, the banners down Main Street with your chairman of your board's name on it, you get stuff like that. So good for you. And that influences the competitive environment. And here's where it gets interesting, I think, for the professions and industries. So this is professional respondents only. And what we're discovering now is the expanding role that employers in particular play in whether or not a person establishes a relationship with the association. So you start to see it here. 40% say there's increased influence by their employers on members' decisions. Meaning if your employer isn't happy with your association, why would I support it? Use your own money and time all you want. Why would I support it? You're also starting to see over here the increased use of professionals with different training. So I just recently had a quick conversation of, actuaries design risk models. Well, so do data scientists. So do I build my company around a credential or do I build it around a competency? And that's where you start to see it show up. On the trade association side, so this is trade associations in particular, it's a crazy intense competitive environment. Both traditional competition, so increased competition from people just like me, to the emerging folks coming into seeking growth opportunities just like me, but last, substitutes. So you're not just for the trade associations in the crowd, you're not just advising your company leaders how to work with a competitive environment from people like them. You're also trying to advise them on a competitive environment where substitutes of their services are impacting it. Your meetings don't compete with meetings. Your meetings compete with Zoom. That's the difference of how you change that frame of reference. It's not a product-to-product comparison. It's a solution-to-solution one. Why should I go to your meeting when I can sit on the Zoom? And no offense to people at the meeting, it's clearly a much better experience. And congrats to the Zoom folks who are sitting in pajamas at home. There's pros and cons to both. But you're not competing with other meetings. You're competing with Zoom when you start to put together a face-to-face event. So what are some of the challenges this world creates? Because I want to be very clear about this. There are nothing but opportunities for associations. And we see evidence of that every single day. Okay, you see it at your own association, your own organizations, you see it among your peers. Let's not pretend associations weren't astonishingly successful at adapting to COVID. and astonishingly successful at experimenting with new ways to create relationships between them and the people they serve. It was an outstanding example of how smart and hardworking all of us are. But you haven't left the problems of 2009 behind you. If you had a terrible value proposition in early January a year ago, you probably still do. If your pricing was off kilter, you probably still have that problem. If your technology didn't work 2 years ago, it probably doesn't work now. So you haven't left anything behind because of the pandemic. I mean, except all the friends we hated and couldn't get rid of, and family members. It's a pandemic. Sorry, Grandma. And dodged her for 2 years. So I'm not saying there aren't positive implications. A lot of laughter on that one, by the way. That hit a little close to home for folks. So you haven't left any of that behind you. Okay, so that's the first issue. 63%, this is in December of 2009. We're concerned about reduced volunteer engagement. Do you think your leadership is more engaged now? For some of you, that may well be true, but they've got influences on them as well, on their time, on their money, on their energy, from their employer, from other organizations seeking their time. Do you think suddenly these people woke up, you know what, I think I should spend more time in volunteer leadership? Probably not. 80% of CEOs who responded say their younger members are uninterested in traditional membership. Now, I don't know how many people here are statisticians or mathematicians. 81% can also be defined as a lot. Okay. And so that's an overwhelming number of people who said before the pandemic, their younger members were uninterested in their traditional membership models. There's an interesting statistic that came out of Marketing General's study. Marketing General does a economic outlook study. I think they're doing it right now. It's in the field. What they discovered last fall was that associations overwhelmingly said their members were more engaged. When they did their membership benchmarking 6 months later, what they discovered was their retention was plummeting. Well, if we're so engaged in the association, why aren't I rejoining? Well, it's because the association was an outstanding platform for the fastest possible way to learn about what was going on when you were trying to adapt to the pandemic. And then they got their renewal letter that listed the benefits, which were meaningless to them. And so the dichotomy between what we offer as our membership offer and how our members actually use the association as a platform for their success is very different. And that's how that starts to show up in the sector data. Big surprise, nearly 7 out of 10 are concerned about member attendance in conventions before the pandemic. You think your meeting value proposition looks substantially different now than it did prior? What innovations have you made? What have you done differently to address this number that existed before the pandemic? By the way, if you took it membership, publications, and meetings, that's where the money's at, as many of you know. And so your financial model is built on a successful face-to-face event. If you went back home and put everybody in your room, how different would it look than 2 years ago when nearly 7 out of 10 CEOs said they were concerned about it? But luckily, you're in a savagely competitive environment. That's the good news. You have all these competitors who are going to force you to do better. And they come from every single direction. So here's the graph. Sources of competition to association. A summary is from everywhere, in every direction. Okay. You're competing with your own members. You're competing with LinkedIn groups. You're competing with the corporate entities that participate in your profession. You're competing with another department down the hallway because members have finite money, finite time, and finite energy. So I'm super smart. Do I sit on the program committee or do I sit on the advocacy committee? So you're literally competing with your own association on those some things as well. Now, I am incredibly optimistic. As I said, there's just nothing but examples of associations that have successfully navigated this, successfully been platforms to help their members through a universally traumatic event. All of us went through it. It wasn't one sector did and another sector didn't. All of us have gone through this. And associations have been phenomenal models of the power of community to ensure that we as people have the best opportunity to navigate something so traumatic. And I think that's an astonishing testament to us as an executive class. We didn't shy away from it. We didn't pretend we couldn't do anything different. We actually did it. Everyone in this room and everyone on our virtual side have successfully gotten through it. Okay. And so for me, I don't look at the assumptions as rubble, but as building blocks. Because one of the things what we've discovered is a lot of legacy things we felt obligated to continue, maybe we're not so obligated anymore. Legacy relationships we felt obligated to continue, maybe we're not so obligated anymore. So what we do is have opportunities to rebuild the association in ways in the next year that would have taken us 5 or 10 years a decade ago. Because our leaders want us to, our stakeholders want us to, and because we want to as an executive class. And so for me personally, what I do is think of it, and I've told the story in a variety of settings, and it's an old story about a gentleman walking through the countryside. And in the distance, he sees 3 builders. And so he walks up to the first builder, and the guy's hammering away and chips are flying up. And he's like, "You, sir, what are you working on?" Guy looks up and smacks a mosquito, white sweat out of his eyes. And like, "I've been out here all day in the hot sun. I'm getting eaten by bugs. Worst job ever." Like, okay. So he walks up to the second person and says, "You, what are you working on?" Guy looks up, kind of satisfied, says, "You know what? Been outside all day, getting a fair day's wage, fair day's pay. Not bad." Like, all right, a little more positive. So he walks up to the third person and says, "You, what are you working on?" Guy looks up, glowing eyes. "I'm building a cathedral." All of us have the same tools we had before. We have membership, we have meetings, we have our online and digital strategies, we have the technological infrastructure that enables all of it. We have all the same tools. We have been removed from a lot of legacy baggage in ways that we couldn't have done without the pandemic. And all we have to do now is decide what we're going to build. And so for me, I choose to look forward and say, you know what? I'm building the cathedral. Because 100 years from now, no one's going to remember any of our names. But they'll remember us as an executive class that navigated our entire profession through this time period and built the foundations upon which every next class of executives will continue. And this is our turn. And there's nothing more fun to do that instead of being the next association exec who does the next conference and the next newsletter. So I encourage all of you to think what that cathedral looks like. Talk to your peers in this room and around and see what they're doing and understand you are making our profession the next best thing, and it starts this year. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.